Shida inakuja, je, tunaaminiana? Contestants kama tuiamini tume, kama tuamini returning officers, lakini kungekuwa kuna ile mutual trust, una jambo lako mnakwenda mnaongea linakuwa rectified pale. Sasa hiyo mutual trust ndio kitu ambacho tunakikosa. Tusingepoteza muda mwingi kwenye electoral disputes. Lakini pia kingine, we need to be very vigilant, hasa kwenye case management. How do we manage electoral disputes? Upande wa mahakama wako very strict kwenye case management sasa hivi kwa zile time limits. Sasa na sisi mawakili kwa upande wetu, we need to be very careful. Hii case management hii inaweza ikatuumiza. Kwa hiyo tujue kwamba ukishakuwa na kesi ya uchaguzi kidogo una extra burden ambayo itabidi vitu vingine kidogo uvipunguzie umuhimu wake. Lakini kingine ambacho nimesema imekuwa ni practice sasa kila mwaka wa uchaguzi. Labda niseme tu kwenye sheria ambazo zinafanywa kazi timely, huwa sheria za uchaguzi. Arbitration Act imechukua miaka 80 kuifanyia marekebisho. Lakini ukiangalia tangu 1990 mpaka sasa hivi sheria za uchaguzi na kanuni zake zimepita ngapi? There are so many. Kwa hiyo msishangae 2025 between now na kipindi cha uchaguzi tukawa tuna new election petition rules. Kwa let's be on our guard. Nadhani hayo ndio maswala ambayo nilikuwa natamani kuya emphasize. Sasa yale mengine ambayo hajabadilika sana, kwa mfano documents to attach kwa ile petition yako ya voters na nini zibaki vile vile. Kwa hiyo hizo nimeona nisiziguse, naomba nimalizie hapa. Asanteni sana.
Asante sana wakili, lakini nadhani disclaimer uliotoa mwanzoni it matters a lot, kwa sababu hizi ni kanuni zilizotengenezwa kwa mujibu wa sheria ya uchaguzi ambayo imefutwa. Kwa sababu kama nilivyosema awali, kusoma kifungu cha 140 sasa hivi kimeshaweka security for cost, sio za determination tena, na imesema every respondent ni milioni 5. Kwa hiyo imerudi ndianabo kama ilivyokuwa awali. Kwa hiyo you can take with the pinch of salt na precaution muichukue, lakini mwisho wa siku hata kutengeneza kanuni kutakuwa hakuna variation kubwa. Japo naamini sasa hivi zile application for security for cost itakuwa hakuna, kama kifungu cha 140 kitabaki kama kilivyo. Kwa hiyo inaweza kaa ni shauri moja tu ya japo study tulikoifanya baada ya implementation ya Ndianabo ni kama ilifanya ikawa ngumu zaidi kuliko hata ile kesi ilivyokuwa awali, japo ni tatizo. Sasa tuna presentation nyingine all the way from Massachusetts, America, from Daniel O'Connor. Sasa sijui kama kwa hata umuuliza wakili good luck maswali au tuende moja kwa moja Massachusetts, Marekani. Tumsikilize Daniel O'Connor from Robes and Gray LLP, ambao ni wataalamu, yani is a former government attorney where he handled the prosecution and investigation of competent entities and individual for civil and criminal violation of federal security laws. Prior to law school, he served as U.S. Navy as an officer on a nuclear submarine. He worked in numerous local and state election campaigns and he handled multiple campaign finance disputes. Nafikiri kwa ile swali alikuwa anazungumziwa hapa kuhusu election financing na mambo mengine. Labda tukiungana naye tusikilize international standard and best practice, how other countries ensure legal accountabilities in the electoral process. So O'Connor is going to share his experience internationally and from regional perspective. I don't know who is going to link him with the audience. Zamani waliokuwa na Radio Tanzania alikuwa akimaliza kuongea anasema fundi mitambo vitu, Sasa fundi mitambo yuko wapi? Okay. Mr. O'Connor, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very well. Please, you are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Jaji O'Connor. I'm an attorney here in Boston, Massachusetts, in the U.S. And with me today, I have a few colleagues that will be helping me with the presentation. I have Rachel Baca, who is an attorney in New York that will be assisting, along with Sam Banker and Mo Greason. Sam and Mo are also attorneys here in Boston with me. We work at the law firm of Ropes and Gray, an international law firm with many offices in the United States and then around the world. Thank you for inviting us to participate. We're here with the assistance of Lawyers Without Borders, who is sponsoring our involvement here and made the introduction. And we appreciate their assistance in getting this set up. We sat through your colleague's presentation and saw the good work there about the system that you have set up within Tanzania to address these disputes. And what we're hoping to do today, very quickly, is to cover issues related to how disputes are addressed across the world. We have a common law system here, as you do as well, and we're going to talk about what are the underlying principles and then the basics that other countries have used, with some case studies at the end to look at different types of dispute mechanisms and how those have been put in place over time. So we're going to start first with international dispute mechanisms and how they work. And I'm going to turn this over to Rachel. And Rachel, I'll just put the screen up here on the side for you and go ahead. Rachel, you're on mute still.
Thanks so much again. And good afternoon, everyone. If you could just get back to the previous slide. You've heard a lot about, that's okay. You've heard a lot about why it's important to have free and fair elections, right? If public officials act in a way that the citizens don't approve, these influences can be removed. Essentially, it allows for accountability, right? And it allows for, and in fact requires, certain fundamental freedoms, like speech and assembly and opinion. And there are many different types of democracies and many different forms of elections and levels of public participation. But these principles that you see up here on the screen are really fundamental in all forms of democracy. And in short, free and fair elections are absolutely fundamental to establishing and maintaining the rule of law. So next slide, please. So elections are inherently competitive, right? And because of this inherently competitive nature, it's inevitable that disputes are going to arise. And the credibility of any electoral process really rests on the ability to resolve disputes, right? If you can peacefully resolve disputes, then the citizens are more likely to trust in the electoral process and strengthen the whole rule of law. And you heard a little bit about the different principles and instruments, international instruments, underlying dispute resolution in the context of elections. But these, and here are a couple on screen, the ICCPR, which you heard about, and the African Union Declaration on Principles Governing Democratic Elections in Africa. And these instruments don't actually set out what types of mechanisms can be used or should be used. So what sorts of mechanisms exist for dispute resolution in the context of elections? Next slide, thank you. So there are, as you can see, there are many, many different ways that our electoral disputes can be addressed. And this here on the screen is by no means an exhaustive list. You have election management bodies, right? They administer elections, but they can also serve as an arbiter of election disputes. You have election audits, right? Those are independent investigations into how the election was carried out, looking for fraud or malpractice. There are recounts. Ballots are cast, or ballots that have already been cast are tallied again, often by a different organization. There are local committees or quasi-judicial bodies. And as you can see, the different types of dispute resolution mechanisms have different pros and cons. Right, election management bodies, for example, might be intimately familiar with how the specific election process was carried out, but they may not be independent. Audits or recounts might be a great way to resolve a dispute about the outcome of an election, but only if the organization that's auditing or recounting the ballots is independent and credible, right? And they have to fulfill their mandate in a way that's acceptable to all the parties involved. And here you've got a couple more on the screen. You've got alternative dispute resolution, which contains a couple of different processes. Processes like mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and negotiation. You have administrative tribunals, which are quasi-judicial in nature, and then of course you have the state judiciary. And there are additional pros and cons for these mechanisms as well, right? Mediation, which you can see here, which is a type of alternative dispute resolution, may be, if you could go back to the previous slide still. Thank you. So that, mediation might be independent and conciliatory, but it might not always be enforceable. The state judiciary, on the other hand, might be able to hand down enforceable orders, but it might not be independent or impartial. And in different contexts, as we're going to see as we get deeper into the examples, different circumstances might lend themselves more or less to a specific type of dispute resolution. And whether or not the resolution is actually successful in ending the dispute may very well be affected by the social or political context outside of the actual election dispute. Next slide, thank you. So in the last slide, I touched a little bit on what's known as alternative dispute resolution, or ADR. And as I noted before, ADR encompasses a number of different resolutions, all of which are voluntary, all of which help the parties to work out their differences, generally with the help of a neutral third party. That's really important. And this third party may be more or less involved, depending on the type of ADR case. And this independent third party may or may not actually suggest possible resolutions for the party to consider. And these are the main types of alternative dispute resolution. But mediation. Mediation is where a neutral third party helps the disputing parties in a very structured manner. Next, you have conciliation, which is a little similar to mediation. And in conciliation, this neutral third party helps the disputing parties come to a consensus. But in contrast to mediation, where the neutral third party generally refrains from proposing any settlements, in conciliation, this neutral third party will typically propose non-binding settlements. But as in mediation, the decision to actually agree on a proposed settlement is up to the parties. And then you have arbitration. Arbitration is a little bit more structured, a little bit more formal than either mediation or conciliation in general. And the neutral third party is less of a facilitator and a lot more like a judge. Typically, arbitration results in this third party arbitrator handing down a binding and non-appealable decision. So the third party is the one who makes the decision as opposed to the parties themselves. And arbitration is similar in this respect to litigation, but arbitration tends to involve a little bit less procedural stringency, right? The parties can make up their own rules a little bit more, and it's typically less expensive than litigation, though that's not always the case. And it's not here on the slide, but in the previous slide we mentioned negotiation, which is another form of alternative dispute resolution. And negotiation is often rather unstructured, perhaps even informal. But negotiation can result in an agreement between the parties, which is voluntary, and the negotiation process itself is voluntary, and it may or may not be facilitated by a third party. But either way, all of these types of alternative dispute resolution help the parties to work through the issues underlying the dispute in a more cooperative way. So I'd like to turn it back to Dan to talk a little bit more about the examples of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that are used in elections around the world.
Thank you, Rachel. So we've gone through and pulled together some examples of how different countries use alternative dispute mechanisms. And these slides will be available as we understand it to you later, but just to give a couple of examples, in El Salvador, because part of this also is designed to provide information to the parties about what's out there to try and avoid disputes up front. El Salvador, the Attorney General's office deploys trained mediators out in the field that make themselves available to try and address the variety of issues that can arise in the course of an election, both inter-party disputes and disputes that happen amongst the actual polling individuals. We have, for example, here we have some green headers and some red headers. The green is designed to show where there's education pre-election that's out there, and the red are places where there are quasi-judicial models that have been set up, bodies that are trying to address these issues in either an arbitration or a conciliation type process. We have some other examples here that have been set up by countries to allow for political parties to work either both internally, mechanisms that exist for a party to result a leadership or nomination issue within the party, or across parties, two different parties coming together. There are election task force, for example, Somaliland that has been set up. Ethiopia has the political party joint forum that was established to address inter-party disputes by dialogue and consent. Again, as Rachel indicated, by their nature, elections are contests. We're all used to that adversarial system, but there are different ways through these types of issues, and different countries have set up a variety of different mechanisms, some of which we've outlined here. There are then administrative tribunals. These are not courts. Typically, they work more informally. The rules of evidence are oftentimes relaxed, but they work on quick deadlines, and they are staffed by experts that know these issues. They may not always be impartial per se, but they act in an impartial manner. Oftentimes, for example, in the United States, the Federal Election Commission is someone that's appointed by the president or his cabinet. And so that is not necessarily an impartial body, but the rules and the procedure are set up such that they act in an impartial, or attempt to act in an impartial manner. And additionally, the organizations usually provide a mechanism for their decisions to be appealed to a court for some sort of judicial review of the actions that have been taken. These again are specialists that have training and prior knowledge, so that when a dispute comes to before them, they can address things in a quickly efficient manner. These are some provisions that an international agency has said when we're looking at our alternative dispute mechanisms, what are the things we want to try to put in place? We want a transparent right of redress. People should know who's going to be addressing their concerns and the process that's going to be there through a clearly defined set of rules and procedures that is put out ahead of time. And there's an expectation that they're going to be followed. You want an impartial arbiter. Now look, not everybody is going to come to this as a completely impartial person, but they need to act in that way. They need to try to find a way to put their biases aside and to let the rule of law, which they are trying to put forward, play through. They need to act in a quick manner. You can't have things in this process drag out over months and months. You need to know that you're going to get to an answer, yes, no, A, B, whatever it is, quickly. You need to have a defined burden of proof. What do we need to show? How much evidence do we need to submit? And what are the evidentiary standards going to be? Can we take in hearsay testimony? Can we take in written affidavits? And you need to have some real mechanism of enforcing the remedies. If things are decided and parties ignore it, what are the consequences of that going to be? And everyone needs to be able to understand this, which means that you need to have education ahead of time. People need to understand where they can turn and how. There's a lot of different international organizations out there. You have access to them all as we do. They've put out different guidelines and standards. We've found these several to be very helpful. They have nice, appropriate mechanisms that you can use as persuasive evidence when standing in front of courts and bodies. Say, this is how it's done in these other organizations. This is what's recommended. And we have found these to be effective to provide the general frameworks and concepts that are put into play. And we heard earlier from your colleagues about the specific issues in your country and how these work and setting these up. You know, you have a very similar system as we understand it. Okay, now we're going to talk just a little bit about where these, look, you know where these disputes fall. Your colleague just took you through them. You have pre-election issues. You know, what's going on within the party, what's going on with voter registration. You know, a committee that is set up to try and put together the debates and the rules for the debates so that the politicians and the candidates going in know what's going on and how that works. Access to polling places is a very common issue that these types of organizations will set up. Where are the polling places? How late will they be open? What types of documents and evidence do we need to get access into the polling places? And then actual challenges to the election results. How are they going to be addressed? Who is going to address them? What level of organization? And how do we appeal decisions, if at all? Are all the issues that are typically coming up. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who's going to address a little bit about how we're going to start off with some of these case studies that we've put together. Sam?
Yep, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so now that we've heard about election dispute resolution generally and sort of gotten a taste of how some countries handle these disputes from Dan, we'd like to share a few more in-depth examples of these dispute mechanisms in action. So in the following slides, we're going to share examples from around the world, including from Kenya, which successfully relied on mediation, national commissions, and local committees to address post-election violence in 2007. We'll look at South Africa, which has relied on a system of national, regional, and party committees to resolve disputes since the 1990s. We'll look at Indonesia, where mediation and restorative justice significantly reduced the need for formal resolution of election disputes through things like the judiciary. We'll take a look at a couple of case studies from election disputes in the United States, where, in contrast to Indonesia, the courts have played a significant role in recent election disputes. And we'll also take a look at Finland, which has a robust and varied election dispute process and is regularly acknowledged as one of the most democratic countries in the world, making it a good example to study. Go to the next slide, please.
Yep.
Thanks. So our first case study is, we're going to take a quick look at the post-election violence in Kenya and the mechanisms that the Kenyans used to address this post-election violence. So in 2007, following the general election between President Kibaki and his challenger, Odinga, there were reports of vote manipulation and vote tally tampering. Unfortunately, this resulted in widespread public violence particularly as voting irregularities were uncovered on both sides of the election. And in response, Kenya utilized some of these alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that we've discussed previously. So they first relied on international mediation, specifically an international mediation effort led by the United Nations Secretary General, who in this functioned as sort of an impartial third party. And this was able to successfully result in a power sharing agreement between Kibaki and Odinga, and eventually resulted in a unity government being able to be formed. Once this unity government was formed, they were able to rely on and form a national commission. They formed multiple national commissions, including a National Cohesion and Integration Commission. Generally speaking, these commissions were mandated with ensuring that the new unity government was passing laws and conducting its public servant hiring in a way that was fair to all political parties and to all ethnicities, given that the violence and the tension around the election turned in large part on ethnic lines. And this commission's recommendations led to significant legal and policy reforms. One of these reforms was providing additional organizational support for a pre-existing function, the local peace committee. And these local committees were initially to resolve local task in 2013, Kenya happily had a very peaceful election, which sort of demonstrates the relative success of these interventions. Okay, so the next case study, we'll take a very quick look at South Africa. We'll look at the system of commissions and committees that they have used in their election dispute resolution. In South Africa, the primary election governance body is the Elections Commission. This is a national level commission which gets authority from the Constitution and critically has funding that does not rely on politics or specific administrations to sustain itself. This gives it a level of impartiality that it might not otherwise have. Beneath the Elections Commission are party liaison committees. These exist at the national, provincial, and municipal levels. And these committees pull members from all registered political parties. And these members then work closely with the Elections Commission to resolve disputes. South Africa also uses a network of conflict management committees, which mediate conflicts locally and can escalate conflicts to the Elections Committee as needed. And so one example of an issue escalated to the Elections Commission was a 2009 general election dispute where there was alleged double voting. The Elections Commission was able to expend resources to investigate the issue. They were able to determine definitively that there was no double voting, and then they were able to rely on their relationships with the political parties through the political party commissions to resolve the sort of disparate effects of this dispute around the country. I'm going to go to the next. One interesting aspect of these different commissions and committees is that they are structurally interrelated. For example, the Elections Commission, which is the national level commission and whose members have legal authority to issue binding conflict resolutions has its members approved by the political party committees, which results in political fairness and sort of a lower level of political bias at the highest level in South Africa. One other notable aspect of these mechanisms is that they are always evolving. For example, the Election Commission, which was established in the 1990s, mostly to deal with election violence, now focuses on a variety of procedural issues. These procedural issues include, for example, the double voting issue that was discussed in connection with the last slide. In addition to changing and evolving its focus, the Election Commission is also evolving its methods to match the times. One example of this is in connection with the 2019 double voting issue. The Election Commission worked very collaboratively with a local media organization to set up an online system for monitoring and addressing the spread of online misinformation. I will now pass it over to my colleague, Mo, to take a look at Indonesia and some of our other case studies.
Hi, thank you, Sam. So in Indonesia, there is a heavy use of mediation processes to solve election-related disputes, which has led to a decrease in formal judicial proceedings. The election supervisory body in Indonesia is called BAWASLU, and it's described as promoting the concept of restorative justice in which the parties' collective participation is based on consensus. The dispute resolution process has been used for years in Indonesia, but was formally delineated in a 2017 election law. And the alternative dispute resolution process there is to mediate over pre-election disputes. And BAWASLU decisions regarding dispute resolution are final and binding, with certain exceptions which include determining presidential and vice presidential candidates. BAWASLU decisions can be appealed to district courts or to a full panel of mediators if only 2 or 3 mediators make the initial decision. The agency is responsible for mediation of administrative election disputes that occur before the announcement of the final election result. And as I mentioned, mediation is the first step upon receiving complaints of pre-election disputes, which includes things like nomination of candidates, party registration, and campaign disputes. The BAWASLU has a large number of trained mediators, as well as formalized mediation processes and a formal timeline, which has led to a high success rate for their mediations. There's about 2,000 officials that have been trained at the central, municipal, and city level as mediators. And they maintain digital records of electoral process disputes, and they're accessible to all offices of the BAWASLU, which allows for tracking and continual improvement of the mediation process. And the decentralized reporting mechanism is essential for this sort of process because it allows for consistency and oversight. The whole mediation process takes 12 working days, which is important because it allows the election deadlines to continue smoothly and the process doesn't get delayed. Just to put some numbers on it, in the 2019 election, BAWASLU addressed over 800 disputes involving the election process, and approximately 50% of those disputes ended at the mediation stage. We can go to the next slide, Dan. So we wanted to provide one other example of a country that actually doesn't use ADR, but has a very formal administrative judicial review process for their elections. So Finland's election dispute mechanisms were established as part of its broader commitment to democratic governance and the rule of law. Unlike some of the examples we've mentioned, these mechanisms were not created in response to a single major crisis or a widespread election dispute, but rather as a proactive measure to ensure transparency and fairness. So they're mainly governed by the Election Act of 1998, which is the election law in Finland. And this law allows for anyone involved in the election process, such as voters, candidates, or parties, to raise concerns about how the election is being run. And the complaints are handled by the local or central election authorities, which investigate and make a decision. And these types of complaints include election conduct, registration, or nominations. Complaints are first addressed by the relevant election authority, which investigates and then decides next steps. And they can choose to appeal these decisions to administrative courts for judicial review. And these administrative courts are the main forum for election appeals. They review the legality of procedures, candidate eligibility, registration, and official conduct, and they're able to review all aspects of the election process. They look for procedural errors or other violations that could impact election outcomes. The court has the ability to order recounts, annul results in specific areas, or call for new elections as needed. As I briefly mentioned, a key feature of the Finnish system is the emphasis on resolving disputes quickly so the election process is not delayed. And also, all hearings are open to the public, which helps maintain public trust in the system. As Sam mentioned, Finland is internationally recognized as having well-administered elections, and there have been instances where dispute mechanisms have been activated, but these instances have been very limited in scope and have not involved large-scale or systemic electoral fraud or violence. Instead, most disputes have centered around administrative errors or candidate eligibility. The absence of large-scale disputes in Finland is a testament to the robustness and credibility of their electoral system. You can go to the next slide, Dan.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about judicial resolution using an example from the United States, and then depending on how much time we have, may do two. So in 2000, I apologize, the slide says 2020, but it's actually 2000, in the United States presidential election, the election came down to the results in the state of Florida. When the initial vote count was done, out of 6 million votes that had been cast, there was a less than a 500 vote difference between Mr. Bush and Vice President Gore. Because of the way the rules work there, such a small difference required that there be a recount of the votes. That recount happened by machine tally. The voting slips were put into the machines, and that difference actually came down. And in the end, it was 321 votes, where Mr. Bush, then became President Bush, was ahead of Mr. Gore. That resulted in some 50 lawsuits being filed in federal court and state court in the state of Florida, challenging the manner in which votes were recounted, the issues associated with transparency around the counting. And it was a very political situation, given that the governor of Florida was Jeb Bush, the brother of George Bush, who was the candidate. Additionally, the Secretary of State in Florida was a Republican as well. And she moved, using an administrative process, to certify the election as complete in the favor of President Bush before the state court decisions had been finalized. The Florida Supreme Court, the highest court in the state of Florida, rejected that certification and said that a manual hand count needed to happen in 4 jurisdictions within the state. That decision by the Florida Supreme Court was appealed to the highest court in the United States, the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. And in a vote of 5 justices to 4, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Mr. Bush. And Mr. Bush was ruled to be the president, in essence, by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that Florida had not done a good job in establishing the rules for how the manual recount was to occur, and given other state rules with respect to timing, that the certification by the Secretary of State in Florida was sufficient to stand for the final results. With the results then certified in the state of Florida, Mr. Bush became President Bush because he got the 25 electoral votes out of that state. That case then, was, at that point, it took almost a month and a half for the election results to be certified, which in the modern era is one of the longest time periods that had been out. The decision was controversial, but in the end, Vice President Gore acknowledged the result and conceded the election to President Bush, who went on to a 4-year term and then re-election in another term. Another recent example of judicial resolution in connection with the presidential election happened in 2020. In the election between President Biden and President Trump. In the aftermath of that election, there were 62 different lawsuits filed across the United States. Those lawsuits challenged a variety of different issues, including whether the right voters were allowed to vote, whether hand-cast manual votes were counted correctly. There were allegations of hacking of certain voting machines. All of those lawsuits were eventually dismissed, and the election results were certified about 4 days after the actual election. Of course, there was violence as the election results were attempted to be verified in the United States Congress. On January 6th of 2021, there was an attack on the House of Congress by protesters, supporters of President Bush. That was put down by the police. The House of Representatives in Congress met, validated the election results, and President Biden was sworn in shortly thereafter. But that was more dealt with on the state and a lower level federal court issues. It never found its way up to the Supreme Court. But much more of an issue associated with a judicial resolution than any ADR or other types of informal resolutions. So that brings us to the end here in terms of what we have to share with the various challenges and issues and how those are dealt with. As lawyers, we know we play a very important role in how these issues are addressed, both in how we represent our clients when issues arise, in educating the public and providing commentary, even in the press, about how these issues can be resolved, trying to address issues that are out there through a misunderstanding of the law. Going back to the example that we mentioned earlier, the 2000 election between Vice President Gore and President Bush, lawyers were actively involved with the recount that was going on, looking over the shoulders of the people that were making the counting, as well as working in court. All across the world, there are a variety of steps that come into play. Lawyers play an important role in advocating for their clients and trying to get these contests addressed in the most fair, impartial way. We oftentimes find ourselves representing individuals who we might not agree with personally, but the rule of law is what you see time and time again in countries that are working with their democracies to get it right. And the rule of law is important, and it's one of the most important roles that we as lawyers play. I think that's all we have now. If there's any questions, the chat or otherwise, we're happy to address them. I understand time is tight, though, so we'll leave it to the folks in the room to decide, where we proceed from here.
Thank you, Dan O'Connor and your team, Samuel Banker, Rachel Bacha, and Mo Grison for your wonderful contribution. It is very enlightening. And guys, you can see it's a global phenomenon, this election disputes resolution mechanisms. If there is any question to this Massachusetts team, before I release them, Bobleo, una swali kwa O'Connor? Okay, Captain Bendera, I don't know if you can follow up from the floor, Mr. O'Connor and your team. There are some questions coming from the floor. Welcome, Mr. Captain.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, my question is, what is the correlation between the direct votes and the college votes, and how democratic is it when direct votes exceed college votes, but college votes get the win? Thank you.
United States, I think, as do you, and a lot of countries with the parliamentary system, although ours is set up, it's different, we have what we would call an indirect democracy. So the popular vote for the president is sometimes different than the actual, in the end, election results. We have 50 states, political subdivisions. Each state has a number of electors. Within each state, there's a mechanism to decide how that state's electors are going to be allocated. Most states in the U.S. have a winner-take-all system, meaning that you look at the popular vote in Massachusetts, you look at the popular vote in Florida, and if one candidate wins the popular vote, they get all of the votes in that state. Some states use a proportional system. Most are that way. Then those electors gather a month and a half after the election, and then they cast their votes. This system goes back to the country's founding over 200 years ago, where that type of indirect democracy, made great sense. There is a lot of debate as to whether in this day and age we should have a direct or indirect system. There's pros and cons in both ways. But there have been circumstances where a candidate will win the popular vote, but not win the election because of that electoral college and indirect system. That has happened. In the Bush-Gore election that I mentioned before, there are debate, but some commentators think that Vice President Gore actually won the overall popular vote in the state of Florida if you looked at the ballots that weren't allowed in the end to be recounted. So it does create some issues, without a doubt. And especially in the last two elections, where the count has been very close, that has raised people to raise issues. But like you, we would have to engage in an entire rewrite of the Constitution, an amendment of our Constitution, which itself is a very difficult process. So I think we are going to live with our electoral college and that indirect system for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you, O'Connor. I'm going to Rugazia, then Bobleo.
Thank you very much. I have a few comments to make. One is that in our system here, apparently we only use the judicial approach to electoral dispute resolutions. So when the presenter was talking about mediation and conciliation, it was like a fairy tale. Things which we don't do here, and the way we are handling our politics, I don't see this happening in the near future. And we had what would call like an administrative tribunal in the 1990s. This was a special tribunal. And after that election, election petitions were handled by this tribunal alone, and there was no right of appeal. The interesting thing is that the sitting prime minister, Joseph Sinde Warioba, was the only person who lost, whose victory was overturned, and apparently after that this tribunal disappeared. We went back again to the court system. You talked about the post-electoral violence in Kenya of 2007, and I heard you mentioning the role by the United States, but it is common knowledge that regional efforts played also a crucial role, and we remember how the late President Mkapa and Jakaya Kikwete also went there, and apparently the United States might have come in when actually the patient was on his way to recovery. A lot had been done locally before the international bodies came. Lastly, I think even when you have the judicial system, the previous presenter talked about cases taking 4 years, during which witnesses may disappear, or in actual fact, they convert, you know, from the previous position. Like we saw in Kenya, election petitions actually have got a timeline where they must be concluded. I think this is something that maybe we should also be having in this country, whereby election petitions and matters related thereto should not take a very, very long time. We have the case of these 19 members of parliament from Chadema. There is a case, you know, rambling on. We don't know what is going on, year out, you know. So if we had a way of disposing these disputes, that could also save a lot in settling down the dust that follows our elections. Having so said, I thank you for your time and attention. Thank you very much.
Any reaction from your end, Mr. O'Connor?
The timeliness issue is very important. I think in the United States, when it comes to issues of validating election results, we also are more inclined to use the courts. Courts in different places, different jurisdictions can move faster, but I think that we have processes in place, which I think is something that is important. And you see in the international standards, when we look at Finland, when we look at other countries that we've mentioned, that the election results need prompt and quick attention. And I think we agree that that's something that we see internationally as a mechanism, because people need government and they need that certainty. So moving things as quick as you can, and perhaps putting in some time periods between the actual election and then the inauguration, when that person is actually put in the office, provides that buffer that can be helpful if you need to have the disputes resolved.
Okay, Leonard Magoyega, the last one.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fulgens Masawe. I have heard a number of examples given by our presenters, including Mr. Daniel Kona, from various countries in relation to the elections conducted thereon. But I would like to discuss about Tanzania, specifically when we have some of the political parties, and particularly one that is Chadema, which says that no reforms, no elections. But on part of the government, it insists that the elections must be done simply because it is the requirement of the Constitution. Under such a situation, what have you to advise us on this aspect? Because we can see that if the government insists that the elections must be done, and one of the political parties, which is very big, huge in our country, insists that if there is no reforms, then there is no election. How can we move? Thank you very much.
It's very difficult. I mean, look, we in our country, we think about this, and I think you have a similar system in some respects of checks and balances. We have the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. And where there is overlap between the judiciary and the legislature, we don't think the legislature is going to do much quickly to handle the issues around the election. We look to the executive and the judiciary. We recognize, like you, that our judiciary is all at the federal level is all appointed by the president. That makes it a political process. However, that judiciary does, after it gets into office, they have lifetime tenure. So they're not worried about the president pulling them out and replacing them. I think that's an important piece of it. I do think you need that rule of law, and you need the judiciary to be checked. We have a trial court, we have an intermediate appeals court, and then we have the Supreme Court. But at each of those levels, they are political appointees. Now, with lifetime appointments, I think we see that in different places, generally to be a workable system. We may not always agree with the decisions that come out from our judges, but we do, as lawyers, try to find a way to respect them. The executive needs to, and this is the challenge, the executive branch needs to follow the judicial decisions. It's an issue we're facing in our country today, in the United States, on a variety of issues, where there's questions as to whether the executive branch, the president's office, will follow what the courts tell him to do. It's a historical issue, one that has existed in I think every democracy at one time or another. The judiciary doesn't have a military, doesn't have a police. They rely upon members of society, especially lawyers, to bring cases and to do what they need to do. And that's what we can do in the end, right? Eventually we have to believe that the rule of law and democratic forces will stand the test of time. It's very difficult, though, living in the moment, I understand. I can tell you here, right now, there are many people that are finding certain difficulties with those types of circumstances. It's challenging. It can be. But that's why we come together in meetings like this, to share ideas and to try and do what we can to advance things. And so with that, I think we'll thank the Law Society for hosting us and asking us to help, and for Lawyers Without Borders for facilitating this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, O'Connor, for your wonderful contribution and making our general meeting more of international perspective, because the experience you have shared is shaped a lot in our mind and our thinking, that the problems are not in Tanzania only, but they are global problems. But everyone has his own means of solving these disputes whenever they arise. But I'm so happy that those who are using mediation and reconciliation as part of solution to this dispute, this election dispute-related issues. We don't want for those happening in Kenya and the like for us to go and sit down and start mediating the democratic issues. So thank you. I think I can release you unless you have another. Asante. Nilikuwa na swali kwa Good Luck, lakini nitakaribisha kwanza NBC na tangazo. Good Luck, nilikuwa nataka kuuliza swali moja. Sisi tuna wagombea ambao wanaenguliwa kabla hata hawajaingia kwenye ballot paper. Je, wanaweza kufaili election petition? Tuache hilo swali. BBC, NBC wako wapi? sponsors, NBC. Nafikiri amesubiri, amechoka, ameondoka, ataongea kesho asubuhi, lakini hili swali lazima ujibu, na mwenye maswali kwa good luck hapa. Sio maswali, mchango Sasa nimebagua, hujanyosha mkono. Basi naomba karibu, nilikuwa sija kuona, labda umefunikwa na captain hapa.
Asante sana moderator wetu Masawe.
Swali naenda kwa nani? Kama ni kwa kuona ongea Kiingereza.
Swali ni mchango wa jumla, lakini limechokozwa zaidi na presenter wetu aliyoko hapo mbele, mheshimiwa wakili hapo. Kwanza niseme naitwa Leticia Petro Mtagazwa, makamu wa rais wa chama cha wanasheria wa Tanganyika, lakini pia mwenyekiti wa wakili welfare mkoba, ambayo nayo ina wanachama 324 ambao ni mawakili wa serikali na mawakili wa kujitegemea. Nimeamua kujitambulisha hapo kwa sababu swala la uchaguzi, kama hauna uchumi, tukitumia ile lugha yetu ya vijana, hautoboi. Hautoboi kwa maana ya kwamba swala la uchaguzi linahitaji gharama. Uwe hata kama wananchi wanakupenda sana, utahitaji gharama, uende kuongea nao, uende kwenye kampeni, uende upange nao vikao na kadhalika na kadhalika. Kwa hiyo ni swala la gharama. Lakini lingine kama ambavyo moderator umesema ni kwamba kila nchi, iwe ni Afrika, iwe ni duniani kote, wana changamoto za uchaguzi. Hamna nchi ambayo 100% haina changamoto za mgogoro kwenye masuala ya uchaguzi. Na hii ni kwa sababu tunapokuwa tunaenda kwenye uchaguzi, kila mtu anakuwa na maslahi yake. Mimi mfano Leticia, maslahi yangu ni kuhakikisha kwamba ninaona wanawake wanakuwa wabunge, wanakuwa madiwani, wanakuwa rais na kadhalika. Lakini kuna mwingine yuko kule kijijini, changamoto yake ni kuhakikisha kwamba mbunge atakayechaguliwa atahakikisha anapata pembejeo za kilimo kwa sababu yeye ni mkulima. Kwa hiyo yale maslahi yanaleta changamoto kwenye masuala ya uchaguzi. Lakini changamoto hizi ni namna gani ya kuhakikisha kwamba tunazitatua? Ni kuwa na platform ambazo zinaweza zikatusaidia kutatua hizo changamoto hata kabla ya kwenda kwenye kesi. Mheshimiwa hapa amesema, je, ametuambia kwamba kuna umuhimu wa kutatua hizi changamoto bila hata kwenda mahakamani kwa kutumia taratibu nyingine za kiutawala, mfano labda kutumia tume ya uchaguzi. Lakini pia ukienda nchi nyingine mbalimbali, wanaunda kamati tofauti kwenye ngazi ya wilaya, kwenye ngazi ya mkoa, kuhakikisha kwamba changamoto yoyote inapojitokeza ya uchaguzi basi inatatuliwa kwa wakati ule ule. Kwa hiyo ni muhimu sana tunapokuwa tunafikiria namna ya kutatua hii migogoro ya uchaguzi, tuaminiane. Na tunaposema tuaminiane, sio tu huku kwenye uchaguzi. Dr. Vicky alikuwa na present hapa kuhusiana na akina mama ambao wanashiriki kwenye nafasi za ubunge, mfano ni 10% tu kwenye viti vya majimboni. Lakini sisi wenyewe hata humu tuliomo humu wasomi, tunawaamini mama zetu, dada zetu, kuwapa nafasi ya kuwa viongozi, kuwapa nafasi ya kugombea udiwani, kuwapa nafasi ya kugombea ubunge? Jibu kwa 99% ni hapana. Sasa ni tunafanyaje sisi kama wasomi? Ni kuhakikisha kwanza, kabla hata hatujaraumu pengine taasisi hii ina mapungufu haya na haya, hata sisi wenyewe tujitafakari. Tunaposema ushirikishwaji wa wanawake, ushirikishwaji wa watu wenye ulemavu na makundi mengine, vijana na kadhalika, je, sisi wenyewe tuna imani na haya makundi? Tunafanya nini kuhakikisha kwamba haya makundi na yenyewe yanashiriki kikamilifu? Kwa hiyo ni jukumu letu sisi sote kuhakikisha kwamba mchakato wa uchaguzi tuna ushiriki kikamilifu kwa kupeana pia na imani. Ninawashukuruni sana. Asante moderator.
Asante sana. Uchaguzi upi ulikuwa unamgombea mwanamke yule Panya? Nafikiri wapiga kura wengi ni wanawake, lakini wagombea wanawake wapati kura. Tuanzie hapo. Panya, karibu.
Asante sana kaka yangu Masawe. I just want to contribute or to ask a question to our presenter, Mr. Goodluck Chua. We've heard about the presentation that came from Mr. Okuda and the team back in the US on how they just focus on alternative dispute resolution, especially on election or electoral process. Your presentation just gave us a highlight exactly on how we can prepare ourselves on electoral petitions, especially after the results, or once the election is complete. What is your thoughts or advice on this fraternity? How we can get prepared for these 2025 general elections instead of focusing on electoral petitions? If there is anything you can advise the fraternity to try to harmonize the alternative dispute resolutions mechanism that can assist the country to have relatively fair and good elections that we are looking forward to have in 2025. I just don't want to keep ourselves busy on the petitions and court process. Let's give it as a second chance. But what can we do now? Just to use the experience we had from others and how we can try to harmonize our systems and give solutions to our good country, Tanzania. Thank you.
Any last reaction from the floor from Seka, and then we close it there because we have exceeded what we have been awarded in our timetable.
Thank you very much. My question relates to what Goodluck had mentioned. The intricacies of preparing for an election, the timelines, and then the fact that you need to be prepared as a lawyer and to master all those skills within the time slot. But then you realize, as of now, 4 months, 5 months, 5 or 6 months before the election, we don't have clear rules. We don't know what rules are going to be used for an election. And you quite rightly mentioned the surprises people got. I think was it 2000 when 2020, 2020, when in the middle of an election petition, the judges themselves were realizing that the law had changed and they were not aware. And it was a law that was passed by the Chief Justice and they were not aware of the law. So this same thing might probably happen this year, because until now we don't know whether the CJ is working on the rules. So my question is, what should the Tanganyika Law Society do to ensure there is participation in preparing the rules? And secondly, what must the TLS and stakeholders do in collaboration with the National Electoral Commission to train lawyers to master the skills of handling an election petition? Because we know if you are doing an election and the law in Tanzania requires each fact to be proved by way of witness statement, you must collect those evidences within the shortest time. What is it that can be done? Should the TLS prepare a special budget for that, so that we may, if your answer is yes, so we can push them during the AGM tomorrow. Thank you.
Asante sana Seka, nafikiri ndio swali la mwisho. Sasa hivi tutamwachia good luck ajibu, alafu tutarudishia secretariat floor. Asante.
Nashukuru sana. Labda naomba nianze na swali la moderator. Umejipendelea amekuwa wa kwanza kuuliza swali. Pamoja kwamba alikula kiapo atakuwa impartial, lakini ameanza kujipendelea mwenyewe. Right, kuna kesi ya wagombea kuinguliwa kabla ya uchaguzi kuanza. Ukisoma section 140 subsection 1 ya Presidential Parliamentary and Councillors Elections Act, 140 subsection 1 inasema who may present an election petition. Wa kwanza, a person who lawfully voted or had a right to vote at the election which the petition relates. Wa pili, a person claiming to have had a right to be nominated or elected at such election. So this person is covered. Sasa changamoto ni at what time atafile petition. Ukiangalia intricacies za kuomba security for costs, ni kama zinafikiria zaidi petition inakuwa file baada ya results kuwa declared. So I would assume akaenda by way of petition, lakini nadhani uamuzi wa kumwengua mtu, that is an administrative decision. My assumption is, and that's my take, kwamba tunaweza pia kwenda kwa judicial review in addition to this petition. That's my opinion. Ndugu yangu Ipilinga Panya, niligusia kidogo kuhusu ADR na nikasema tumeinvest sana kwenye litigation, hasa kwenye elections, tofauti kabisa maeneo mengine. Sasa the challenge is, siku zote ADR, the key is trust. Ukienda kwenye ADR kama hamwaminiani, hamtafikia popote. Kama hamwaminiani, sijajua ndugu yangu Fulgens, unapenda kituo cha kupiga kura, unakuta askari kama 15, wale kazi yao ni kulinda usalama kwa wewe na wengine utolewa kupali. Sijui kama unaamini hilo ndio jukumu lao wanalifanya pale, sijui. Na wale askari wapokuwa pale, wakiona kundi la wanachama wamekuja wanasema wanataka kulinda kura zao, sijui kama wanawaamini. Nadhani kama taifa tumefikia mahali ambapo hasa inapokuja kwenye masuala ya uchaguzi hakuna anayemwamini mwenzake. That's the challenge. Pale pakiwa patakapokuwa na mutual trust, naamini kabisa hatutakuwa na haja ya kwenda kwenye mashauri ya uchaguzi. Kiatupeleka kwenye mashauri na hizi all intricacies na hizi speed na hizi investments, nadhani ni kwamba taasisi haziaminiani, individuals hawaaminiani, vyama pia sidhani kama vyama vinaaminiana. Sasa building trust is a long process. Is a long process. Mimi nadhani hatujachelewa, tutafika, lakini tuanze. Lakini kubwa ni imani. Sasa imefikia mahali kuna watu wana declare interest, lakini watu ambao tulitegemea au wana vile viapo vyetu. Sasa kama ni mmoja au ni wawili, sasa sisi tuwaconclude kwamba ndio wote wako hivyo. Kwa hiyo nadhani pia hizi taasisi ambazo kuna mmoja amejitokeza akadeclare kuwa partisan, basi ni vizuri taasisi zikisimama zikasema huu ni msimamo wake binafsi, sio msimamo wa taasisi yetu. Lakini tunapokaa kimya kidogo inaleta picha ambayo ni kama taasisi za kondoo hicho kitu. Kingine kuna swali moja ambalo ni la mtego. Rais wangu wa zamani Seka kwamba kesho kwenye AGM tusemeje. Naomba niwaachie, naomba mniruhusu nisilijibu hilo. Moderator, naomba niruhusu hilo nisilijibu, ila nijibu mengine ambayo wameongelea Seka.
Rais yupo amelisikia. Utajibu rais na jinsi yake.
Nisije nikatuhumiwa kwa uchochezi na baraza la uongozi la TLS. Sasa kuna moja hili, lakini kwamba mawakili tujiandae vipi kwa hizi intricacies. Na hili pia nadhani mimi ningewatia TLS. Ila tuniwaambie kwa upande wa mahakama judicial. Sasa naomba niongee kama Deputy Principal wa Institute of Judicial Administration Lushoto. Kwa upande wa mahakama tayari trainings zimeshaandaliwa. Kwa hiyo very soon mahakama itaanza kutrain judicial officers kuhusu handling of electoral disputes. Hapa nina copy. This is the Judicial Training Curriculum on Election Dispute Resolution, July 2024. Here I have quick reference for magistrates in district courts on election dispute resolution, 2024 July. Tumeshajiandaa. Here is a facilitator's guide on election dispute resolution judicial training 2024. Sasa wenzetu wa mahakama wameshajiandaa kutupokea. Sisi tumejiandaaje kwenda kwao? Kwa trainings za judicial officers kuanzia judges wa court of appeal tayari zimeshaandaliwa. Kwa hiyo kwa upande wa TLS naomba niwaachie viongozi wangu, ila tutujue kwamba wenzetu upande wa pili tayari wameshajiandaa.
Kuna swali la Leticia upande wa ushiriki wa wanawake na changamoto zilizopo. Hata security for cost na fikiri zikaumiza sana wanawake kwenye uchaguzi.
Kama sikulipata vizuri, kama naweza karudia. Was it a question?
It was just a contribution. Thank you.
Nashukuru.
Basi naomba nikushukuru ndugu yangu Gulak Chua, na nishukuru GC kwa imani waliotuonyesha kwetu sisi panelisti pamoja na moderator. Kwa wale ambao na maswali kwa Okona na timu yake, secretariat imesema itakuwa nachukua emails, kwa hiyo mnaweza mkawaandikia wasiliana yote tu kampa, ama swali tena mtapata majibu. Lakini vinginevyo niwashukuru kwa muda huu. It was wonderful time interacting with you, na tutaendelea kuwepo. Kwa hiyo naomba Mariam, sijui nikurudishie kiti chako au other house rules. Kuna swali tena? Pointi.
What Seka has said ni kwamba tumekaa tangu asubuhi, tumesikiliza maelezo mengi katika mambo ya uchaguzi. What are we telling the AGM? What are we proposing to the AGM? What resolutions are we proposing? Training, ADR, all these matters have come today. So what are we proposing to the AGM tomorrow?
Kulikuwa kuna rapotua kwenye mkutano? Ya lazima kuwa na resolution ambazo zinatoka kwenye hii ziende kwenye kama recommendation. Mariam, unasikia?
Ndiyo, nimesikia. Naambiwa hapa na rapporteurs kwamba hakukuwa na resolution, kulikuwa kuna discussions tu. Nadhani ni vyema ikaonekana resolutions za all the discussions zilizotokea ni zipi sasa, kwa sababu wamezi capture kama deliberations tu na discussion, no tangible resolutions. that has been made.
Sasa ndio tunatakiwa tufanye sasa hivi, au si ndio hivyo Seka? Kutokana na discussion kama zijawa captured.
Yeah, labda unajua sisi kama TLS tufike mahali sasa tubadilike. Tumespend hela kwenye huu mkutano. Malengo ya huu mkutano ni nini? Na ilikuwa ni kutufanyisha hii CLE au kuna kitu tunataka kama TLS kukifanya kwenye uchaguzi wa mwaka huu? Kwa sababu tumekuwa na makongamano yameshaanza, symposium, lakini tumekuja sasa tumeshirikisha na wanachama wote. Lengo hasa la conference ya leo labda pengine hatukulisikia au labda halikuwa clear, ilikuwa ni nini? Kutupa knowledge, alafu kila mmoja aamue cha kwake kutokana na alichojifunza, au kuna some specific interests ambayo governing council inayo kuhusiana na kutaka kushirikisha wanachama wake kwenye annual conference, ili labda kuwe na some deliberations zinazoweza kuwa na mchango kwenye kuinformu maamuzi ya governing council. Sasa labda kwa sababu sijamuona president lakini vice yupo, wanaweza kidogo kutumegea kama sehemu ya closing. Je, lengo hasa la mkutano huu ni nini, na baada ya hapa ni nini ambacho tunatarajia kukifanya, ili tujue kama lengo ni kufanya tu hizi deliberations alafu tuondoke, basi tuondoke. Lakini kama kuna namna ambayo kuna malengo ya msingi yanayotakiwa kufanya, ili tunapokwenda kesho kwenye labda maamuzi tuamue. Kama tumejifusikia hapa watu wanasema tufungue kesi, kuna ambao wameonyesha kanuni zina changamoto. Je, TLS inataka kuingia huko kwenye hizi siasa za kubadilisha sheria, au inataka nayo kuwa mtazamaji, mtazamaji kama wengine? Kwa hiyo sasa lazima hayo tuyajue, ili tuweze kabla tujaondoka tujue hivi huu muda tuliotumia hapa ni kwa ajili yetu ya kupata knowledge au na kuisaidia chama chetu kufanya maamuzi. Asante.
Asante moderator. Nadhani practically annual conference imekuwa ni sehemu ya mjadala, na baada ya mjadala huwa zinatoka recommendations. Zile recommendations ndio zinakwenda kwenye general meeting kwa ajili ya endorsement, kwa ajili ya kufanyiwa kazi, kwa sababu annual conference haiwezi kutoa resolutions. So kinachotakiwa vile vitu ambavyo vimekuwa deliberated here, members ambao wako wanatakiwa kutoa recommendation. Ni vitu gani ambavyo mnadhani vinatakiwa kwenda kwenye general meeting kesho kama sehemu ya endorsement na ya resolution ya haya maamuzi kwa ajili ya kuyafanyia kazi?
Ndio mzee Bendera.
CEO, kwanza hili la mwisho, kama judiciary wameji-educate, wamekaa wamepublish na vitabu, tunaomba huyu ambaye ametupa leo lecture hapa tumpe tena nyingine, tukae tufundishwe. Kwa hiyo resolution moja hapo ni kwamba TLS ifanye mtaratibu wa kuwafundisha members jinsi gani ya kujiandaa mawakili katika hizi sheria ambazo hazitaki hata kwenda kutoa nafasi ya mtu kwenda kugombea jambo lake mahakamani. That is very important. La pili ambalo ni very important also ni jinsi ambavyo sheria, kwanza katiba, kuna katiba ya Zanzibar kwenye uchaguzi wa Zanzibar huko hatuingilii, lakini mtu yule wa Zanzibar anagombea pia uchaguzi wa bara. Kwa hiyo kuna umuhimu sasa kuangalia ni kitu gani tuunde kama timu whatever, au ile komiti yetu ya legislation na ya mambo ya sheria ikae iangalie mapendekezo gani tunayapeleka serikalini kwa kubadilisha sheria kukidhi mfumo mzuri wa uchaguzi. Nadhani hayo mawili ndio kwangu mimi, na kuna mengine karibuni.
Bob Leo na Seka, mnataka kutoa resolution au mnataka kuchangia?
Mimi kwangu ni kuongeza kwa tunasema tunafanya kwa ajili ya kesho. kitu gani wale wanaoraporteurs waseme hiki ndio kimetoka kwenye nani ya kesho ya leo kwa ajili ya kesho, ili sasa viingie, sijui vitaingiaje, watatuambia wenyewe secretariat na GC. Lakini na mimi nilikuwa na recommendation moja, ni kutambua kwamba tukisoma sheria na imeelezwa hapa na hizi sheria nyingine na kanuni zake, definitely kunaonekana kuna changamoto, na nafikiri nimeona pia andiko la kanuni la TLS na THRDC kwamba kanuni bado zina matatizo na zina rhyme kwenye no reform no election basis, kwa sababu tukienda kwa kanuni hizi ambazo TLS nayo imeziona, inawezekana tusiwe na uchaguzi wenye free and fair elections. Lakini baada ya mambo haya yanahitaji mabadiliko ya sheria. Sasa bunge linafungwa tarehe 27 mwezi wa 6. Kwa hiyo tuna mwezi na nusu. In case bunge linavunjwa kabla sheria hazijabadilika, tunaenda kwenye uchaguzi. Sisi kama wadau wa sheria tunaosimamia section 4, what will be our role at that point in time? Na sisi tunasusia uchaguzi au tunaenda na uchaguzi lakini tunachukua hatua? Kwa sababu hili ni jambo kubwa sana linalohusiana na haki za Watanzania, na sisi tumesema tunasimamia hizo haki. Kwa hiyo lazima tufike mahali tuamue which ground, we cannot play middle ground. We must take a position of some sort. Is there something that we can do legally within our competence kati ya sasa? Acha kupeleka mapendekezo ambayo yanaweza asifanyiwe kazi. Nini kingine tunachoweza kukifanya in the worst case scenario, ili tuhakikishe kwamba uchaguzi wa mwaka huu unakuwa tofauti na chaguzi tulizozishuhudia ambazo wengi wetu, na nafikiri ni position pia ya TLS, kwamba hazikuwa free, fair wala transparent. Maana nafikiri hiyo ni position, sidhani kama imebadilika kwa upande wa TLS. Maana tulikuwa nasema hata si uchaguzi wetu ni free and fair kuliko wa serikali kwa kumchagua Mwabukusi, kwa sababu ulikwenda nao mpaka mahakamani na nini. Kwa hiyo tunachukua position gani? Sasa wanaweza kufanya maamuzi hayo ni wanachama kesho. Kwa mimi nilikuwa nataka tutoe mapendekezo haya kwamba perhaps either GC kisha baada ya kuona kilichojadiliwa hapa inaweza ikakaa leo take position gani ya kupeleka kwa wanachama kesho, ili wafanye maamuzi on behalf. Kwa hiyo nilikuwa nataka tu hilo pendekezo kwamba GC ione haja ya kupeleka something substantial kesho kuhusiana na uchaguzi, baada ya kuspendi hela hizi za kwetu kuorganize huu mkutano ambao umeonyesha kuna changamoto bado zipo na zitaendelea kuwepo towards the election, ili wanachama waweze kufanya maamuzi.
Seka, asante. Lakini watoe wasiwasi kitu kimoja. Nafikiri muda wa kuchukua maoni huwa hauna ukomo, hata bunge linavunjwa kesho. Maoni yachukuliwe, sheria ziboreshwe. Wataboresha lini is none of our business. Lakini wakumbushe kitu kingine, changamoto zinaweza kwenye uchaguzi wetu hata sio sheria. Kuna ambayo yanafanyika nje ya mfumo wa sheria. Kwa hiyo tusipowapigia kelele tukasema sio bunge linavunjwa, tutakuwa tunawakosea wananchi heshima. Tena yale mabaya zaidi sio kwenye mfumo wa uchaguzi, haiko kwenye sheria. Mtu kutoweka kule na timu ya Namungo iliko anakuja kuokotwa Mbagala, ni sheria inasema hivyo. Kuingua mtu kwa kuandika DSM bala Dar es Salaam, ni sheria inasema? Au kusema kwamba umekosea jinsia au hujui kusoma na kuandika wakati ulikuwa diwani ulimaliza muda wako ndio umerudi tena sasa unaambiwa hujui kusoma na kuandika, ni sheria inasema hivyo. Kwa hiyo kuna issues za impunity na mambo mengine nafikiri ndio na address zaidi
ambazo tunakuwa tumezinyamazia kwa sababu tumeshaziona kwa miaka miwili.
Tumezinyamazia, ndio maana nasema usikate tamaa sana. Ni kwamba let us take the stock. GC iko hapa, secretariat ipo, na yote yaliyoongelewa pia mengine yalikuwa online, yako recorded, so they can deduce anything writing, pamoja na yale ambayo tuliyafanya kwenye symposium nafikiri tulifanya summary pale mwishoni, ambapo tusema ndio maazimio ambayo tukana na ile symposium. Kwa hiyo ni kazi, yani mchakato ni mkubwa huu na maoni ni mengi. Na haya yote hapa hata unayotaja mengine hata kwenye majukwaa ya kisiasa, ukiangalia content yake bado relevant. Kwa hiyo nadhani hakuna kitu kipya, labda tumsikilize sasa hivi na Leonard hapo ili nimalize. Au mnataka kukesha? Tufanye vigil ya uchaguzi. Leonard.
Asante sana Bwana Florence Masawe, my classmate at the University of Dar es Salaam. Jambo nalotaka kuchangia hapo ni dogo tu. What is the practice normally tunapokuwa na vikao kama hivi? Sidhani kama watu wanatoka na resolutions katika kikao kama hiki cha leo ambacho tumekuwa tukifanya kila mwaka. Kwa hiyo what is important ni kesho tukikutana resolutions wao zinatengenezwa wakati wa kikao chetu cha kesho. Kwa hiyo sione kama kuna sababu ya kuendelea kuconcentrate kuangalia kwamba leo mkutano wa leo ulikuwa na manufaa gani. Manufaa yapo, it's very obvious, hata tukipata elimu tu inatosha. And what was the reason for us to meet here today? Tuendelee na sababu hizo hizo. Kwa hiyo hakuna sababu ya kuendelea kupoteza muda hapa kutengeneza recommendations na nini, wakati tunajua mambo hayo yatakuwa resolved tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Asante. Naomba mimi na good luck tuachie hii meza, tumkaribishe Mariam na timu yako kwa ajili ya of the rest of the day program activities. Asante.
Jamani, labda takuwa sio wingi wa shukrani kwa kazi nzuri ambayo ameifanya msomi Senior Masawe bila kumpigia makofi ya nguvu. Kwa hiyo tutapiga, naomba nitoe maelekezo ya pongezi. Tutapiga makofi 5421. 5421 tunapiga 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 1. Twende waheshimiwa. Sasa tumekosea. Haya, tunaanza 1 2 twende. Akiwemo panya amekosea kupiga makofi. Nashukuruni sana waheshimiwa. Asante sana. Nadhani ni secretariat tu mna matangazo au nitakiwa tuje huko.
Habari za jioni na hongereni kwa good discussion. Tunawashukuru sana kwa niaba ya Governing Council na Secretariat Tanganyika Law Society. Tunawashukuru kwa kuweza kuvumilia na kukaa mpaka muda huu. Tunathamini sana michango yenu.
Nimekutana naye sana kwa anataka kurekebisha.
Tunashukuru sana kwa uwepo wenu na tunaomba tu tuwakaribishe kesho kwenye general meeting ambayo itaanza saa 2. Lakini kabla ya general meeting kuanza, tuliombwa na judiciary kwa ajili ya watu wa mfumo wa judiciary kuja kuwapitisha masuala yanayohusiana na mfumo katika shughuli zenu mnazofanyia kazi, na sisi tukaona ni muhimu na ni of interest kwenu nyinyi members. Tukawaruhusu waje wafanye presentation yao ya nusu saa. Kwa hiyo kesho saa 2 kamili mpaka saa 2:30 watakuwa wanafanya hiyo presentation. Baada ya hapo tutaendelea na general meeting. Karibuni sana. Nawatakia jioni njema. Enjoy Arusha.
Anauliza ati kuna chai ya jioni. Kuna chai ya jioni eti? Haipo, maana Seka anataka adeshi usiku asile. Asanteni sana waheshimiwa, lakini pia tujitahidi kuwahi waheshimiwa. Muda ni changamoto sana, tuwahi.
Asante, kuna mtu amesahau ufunguo. Ameudondosha ufunguo hapa. Kwa hiyo kama ni wa kwako basi jaribu kufika secretariat room utaupata.